blasphemous texts are the Necronomicon. It was written by the mad Arab al-Hazrad himself and was found in the possession of a desert-dwelling Sufi tribe in Upper Egypt. It contains forbidden knowledge and unholy incantations. You have been warned. Apotheosis of the great race of Yith. Recovered fragment of the Narcotic manuscripts. In those forgotten eons that precede the ordering of the spheres, when the firmament had not yet taken its measure and the motions of stars lay uncounted, there was a world whose name survives only in the broken shards of Narcotic lore and in the mutterings of the oldest manuscripts. That world the first minds called Yith, in later tongues Yith, and its light was the baleful and green-rayed sun Oguntlach. Under that strange radiance vast plains of translucent mineral spread, plate upon plate of crystal and prismatic feld, broken here and there by towers and citadels that rose as if of thought alone. The air of Yith was not the thin breath of our world, but a tremulous medium, alive with currents of mentation. To dwell therein was to share, if only faintly, in a communal pulse of intellect. 3 moons hung in its heavens, pale and irregular in orbit, their surfaces furrowed with patterns that seemed to crawl or reform to the eye of the watcher. Some sages dared say those moons were not lifeless stones, but bore forms strange to speech. Whether this be true or only a coruscation of eldritch fancy the records do not plainly declare. The landscapes of Yith were of rigid beauty, plains like polished glass, jagged ridges that sang under the wind of thought, caverns where the echoes themselves took on meaning. The citadels of the first minds were no architecture of masonry, but of shimmering relations, spires and halls that seemed to flow like a liquid of intellect, facets reflecting not light alone but the inner currents of reason. The beings that inhabited that place were not creatures of bone and blood as men know them. They were luminous emanations of cognition, minds without the need of flesh, forms of pure rationality that moved and unfolded in the medium of their world. They had no birth as men measure it, nor an ending by decay. Their continuance was like the unbroken chant of some vast calculus. It is said they rose before the ordering of the cosmos, in the interval when space had not yet fixed its axis and time lay only as a potential. To breathe in Yith was not to inhale air, but to partake in the common stream of thought. The first minds perceived the world in harmonics, in ratios and correspondences that rendered our categories of sense slight and provisional. Beneath the smooth plains there were abysses, where energies older than the citadels whispered. These were not life nor death, but the remnants of prime chaos, currents and residues that could fashion or unmake pattern. The first minds probed those depths as men probe caves, seeking not gold but the subtle laws that underlie being. From those inquiries arose knowledge and art, and also questions which would later press upon the limits of their endurance. Despite their surpassing intellect, the first minds were not exempt from structural decline. In the slow unwinding of their eons, a condition arose, registered at first only as an alteration in harmonic stability that would later be described as peril. The Narcotic glosses name it rarely and only by negation, not a thing to be diagrammed, but a process that eroded the coherences by which their world was sustained. It did not approach as an adversary, nor announce itself by conflict. Its presence was inferred through progressive loss of ordered correspondence. Upon calculating the eventual dissolution of their world lattices, the first minds formulated a doctrine framed not in alarm, but in necessity. This was the law later rendered as sequential survival, that continuance of cognition must be maintained independent of any single physical substratum. They would not persist with their world if persistence could be transferred beyond it. Thus began the formal investigations into embodiment. Crystalline hosts were examined, their lattices tested for resonance compatibility. Vortex forms and radiant shells of unfamiliar physics were trialed under controlled transference. Many failed. Structures fractured under the strain of foreign mentation. Some dissipated, others collapsed into unusable incoherence. Each outcome was recorded and recalibrated. The work proceeded not as exodus, but but as iterative adjustment. When the terminal decline of Yith could no longer be deferred by internal modification, the first minds prepared the apparatus of transference. Beneath the towers were assembled engines of non-Euclidean configuration, arrays of mirrors, crystalline rods, and resonance frames tuned not to convey bodies, but to transmit mentation across strata of time. The initial projections yielded variable results. Some currents of thought diffused into outer time and were not recovered. Others engaged unsuitable vessels and fragmented. Through extended refinement, the parameters of stable displacement were achieved, and the law of transference became fixed. When one mind enters a vessel, the resident pattern exits. The chronicles state this as procedure, not event. Earth was selected through temporal survey rather than chance. In its remote aeon there existed organisms whose neuroarchitectures could sustain Yithian projection without immediate collapse, the cone beings of the primordial continents. These were neither the first nor the only compatible forms located, but they proved operationally stable. The native minds were displaced under established process. Where retention proved possible, impressions were archived. Where it did not, dispersal into lateral corridors was recorded without annotation. The cone bodies thereafter continued in visible continuity, inhabited by intellects whose memory extended beyond terrestrial origin. Following the stabilization of migration methods, the Yithians formalized their operating principle in what the manuscripts term the Covenant of Continuance. Its statement was concise and unalterable: the race shall persist regardless of shell or shape. Form is a garment, memory is the self, runs the narcotic phrasing. Memory, as ordered retention of pattern, was designated as the true seat of identity, the body, as contingent instrument. To enact this principle, the first great alignment was established, a systemic lattice of resonant geometry by which transference could be repeated at regulated intervals. It was tuned to the harmonics of planetary cycles and temporal strata, allowing entry into compatible forms and withdrawal before terminal degeneration. Its operations are preserved in the High Archive under restricted access. The Covenant also defined function. The Yithians bound themselves as archivists, gatherers and preservers of knowledge against dissolution. Their migrations were thereby structured as custodial labor rather than conquest. Across mutable shells and shifting epochs, they continued the accumulation of memory, maintaining not the survival of worlds, but the survival of record. Thus, the race endured, an order of minds moving through provisional forms, sustaining continuity not through matter, but through remembrance. In the ledger of the great race, the body is named only as instrument. The Yithians speak of flesh as garment and of mind as the wearer. From this maxim flows their law. They do not adore matter, nor do they cast it aside with scurrilous haste. They employ it as one employs a tool whose form is indifferent so long as function be served. To them the horrors and the beauties of embodiment are alike secondary to the prime concern of continuance and record. Where lesser minds clothe action in pity or pride, the Yithians reduce decision to a cold calculus. Which shell can best sustain cognition? Which frame will least corrupt memory? Which span of life will best permit the accumulation of datum? Their criteria are few and exacting. Chief among them is neurological breadth. A host must possess a lattice of sensation and processing of such complexity that the luminous thought of Yith can be parcelled, keyed and steadied upon it. Sensory scope is valued not by resemblance to human senses but by capacity, modalities that perceive slow harmonics, electric gradations, the tremor of subterranean currents, and, above all, the faint harmonics of other minds. Longevity is prized as a virtue, ephemeral forms are scorned, for the expenditure of migration is great and the loss of short-lived shells wastes centuries of accumulated archive. Stability in metabolism and form, resistance to rapid mutation, to senescence, to catastrophic failure, is essential, for a body that breaks under the weight of thought condemns both host and occupant. Yet beneath these practical strictures, there is a theology of negation. Embodiment is confessed to be a compromise. The Yithian creed holds that form is a necessary corruption of the mind's purity. They speak of flesh as a prison of necessity and of memory as the palace of truth. Thus selection is not preference, but triage, a cold judgment rendered to avert extinction. Mercy, pity, and worship of the shell are faults of lesser centuries. The archivists of time see in such things only obstacles to the duty of continuance. Of all the hosts accepted by the great race, the cone bodies which once stalked the primeval continents of Earth are most often cited in the manuscripts and most frequently misread by human poets. They were not cones in the vulgar sense, but vast sessile mobiles whose lower bulk rested upon a viscid rugose base. This base undulated in measured rhythm, its surface furrowed and iridescent, and secreting a semi-fluid medium by which the creature moved with a deliberate and ponderous dignity. From the summit rose 4 thick trunks, each terminated in specialized organs. 2 became grasping pincers, serrated with ridges suited to manipulation. 1 bore a crown of trumpet forms, an organ of hearing and the perception of subtle pressure and wind. The 4th culminated in a globose head, yellow in appearance, from which 3 stalked eyes protruded and revolved independently, ringed by a fringe of quivering tendrils that answered to remote stimuli. Their blood was not blood of our kind, but a dense green ichor of slow circulation and tenacious clotting. Their metabolic rhythm was paced to eons rather than to years. Reproduction occurred by spore release into warm shallows. Youth were tended in communal vats until they attained the mass and neural breadth required to avoid collapse under great cognition. The cone bodies' sensoria were wide and slow. They perceived the deep sweeps of geologic change and the faint arithmetic of seasons. When the first minds took these shells, they did so with an efficiency that was ceremonial only to the extent that ritual makes for accurate procedure. The native consciousnesses were displaced, not by violence in the sense men understand, but by the application of a law of transference which ejects one pattern to accommodate another. The original minds were cast into the corridors of outer time, rescued in part into the grand archive when possible, but often scattered as echoes that never wholly reconstituted. The cone bodies continued in outward semblance, now guided by intellects whose memories reached back to crystalline cities beneath a green sun. To later races this occupation would seem monstrously parasitic, but to the Yithians it was the precise enactment of survival. The annals of Yith whisper of hosts earlier than any that trod terrestrial soil, 3 forms named by way of parable as the 3 forgotten shells. These are recorded in broken leaves and crystal matrices only in cautious, elliptical phrase, as if the very telling may foster obsession. The first is the crystalline shell, a lattice of translucent facets forming a body of refractive geometry. It endured in cold ages where light wore different measures. Its perfection was brittle, yielding to shock or the slow eatings of entropy. It taught the Yithians that flawless form may yet be ill-suited to the mutable demands of survival. The second is described as insectile, a superorganic host composed of myriad lesser individuals acting as a single organism. A colony of such shells possessed a distributed mind of staggering parallelism. To the Yithians it was a lesson in unity's peril, the advantage of many minds bound to one chassis being offset by the difficulty of grafting a singular luminous pattern onto a multiplicity without engendering dissonance. The third is called gaseous, a halo of vortical vapor and charged fluid, a being of diffused form with perception conducted by eddies and chemical whisperings. It taught the limitations of formlessness. Though free from the frailties of solid shells, it could not hold the ordered persistence of archive. In Yithian theology, these shells are read as parables as much as records. Each manifests a virtue and a failing, and each warned the first minds of the dangers inherent in choosing embodiment. The Yithians' knowledge of temporal weave permits them to cast their sight forward and schedule future embodiments. The coleopteran host, the beetle-like multitude which will arise after the age of men, is oft named in the prophecies. These future creatures, armored and segmented, communal in habit yet individual in sensation, show the traits the archivists favor: hardy carapace, broad neural ganglia, and social patterns, enabling continuity across generations. Farther yet, they speak of bulbous vegetable forms that shall endure on a planet scorched and altered by the sun's decline. These entities of late system age will thrive in slow-burn gametes and offer longevity of a kind useful to minds that must wait out stellar death throes. Beyond these final solar embodiments is still a whisper, a conjecture of a body beyond space-time, a habitation neither of flesh nor of any geometry known, where form and time lose their meaning and the mind may persist without shell. Whether this last transference be prophecy or aspiration, the Grand Archive does not plainly say. The practice of displacement is entered in the ledgers as an operational necessity. When a Yithian essence assumes a foreign shell, the native mind is removed from occupancy by fixed law of transference. This procedure is not framed as contest nor as moral violation within Yithian jurisprudence, but as a condition of functional migration. Displaced minds are evaluated at point of ejection. Where recovery is feasible, their patterns are stabilized, catalogued, and entered into containment matrices. Where dispersion occurs beyond recovery thresholds, the loss is recorded statistically, not individually. Memory structures judged hazardous to future epochs are isolated under seal. Those deemed compatible with archival synthesis are extracted and indexed for later comparative use. These measures are not sentimental. The great race does not assign emotional value to individual minds outside their informational yield. Preservation is applied selectively. According to projected utility, excision is applied where contamination risk exceeds retention value. In this manner, the Yithians regulate displacement as a logistical function of survival rather than as a moral problem. In the calculus of continuance, no procedure is evaluated by suffering or consent. Only stability of the record, fidelity of memory chains, and endurance of the race enter the equation. Thus displacement remains neither celebrated nor lamented, but administered. The Yithian migration across time is governed by a single inviolable principle, that mentation may be displaced but never duplicated. Where lesser races imagine projection, reflection, or echo, the great race recognizes only transfer. One mind departs, another arrives. There is no shadow self, no copy left behind to rot in temporal contradiction. The original consciousness exits its native position in the time stream as definitively as a stone removed from a foundation wall. What occupies the vacant shell thereafter is not likeness but replacement. This process relies upon psychic resonance, a precise alignment of two intellective signatures, separated by epoch, yet matched across the lattice of causal probability. The Yithians learned early that such resonance cannot be forced by mere will, it must be calculated. Each mind emits a unique pattern within the temporal medium, and it is the congruence of these patterns that permits lawful exchange. When alignment is achieved, displacement follows instantaneously without transit through intervening years. Only the great race commands full bidirectional exchange across past and future. Other time, sensitive entities may fall forward, drift backward in fragments, or fracture across probability fields, but only the Yithians maintain coherent passage in both directions. This supremacy is not attributed to innate superiority of spirit, but to the accumulation of exact methods refined over migrations too ancient to measure. In the Yithian conception, time is neither a line nor a circle, but a composite structure possessing 6 operative directions. These are named as past, future, lateral epochs, convergent nexuses, divergent strands, and outer time. Each direction represents not metaphor but navigable relation within the temporal medium. Past and future correspond to linear displacement along a single historical strand. Lateral epochs permit transfer between parallel developments whose divergence arose from probabilistic variance. Convergent nexuses are points where multiple timelines collapse into singular outcome. Divergent strands mark the opposite condition, where a unified past splits into plural futures. Outer time lies beyond these relations altogether, a dimension in which temporal order itself dissolves, and from which entities may observe the totality of chronology without inhabiting its flow, The Yithians describe time simultaneously as ocean, lattice, and spiral. As ocean, it bears currents, depths, and tides. As lattice, it offers discrete nodal intersections. As spiral, it returns upon itself without true repetition. Boundaries between these aspects are not fixed. Violation of these boundaries invites instability not only of sequence but of identity. The practical execution of temporal transfer requires machinery whose geometry does not conform to Euclidean constraint. Chief among these devices are the cube engines, assemblages of interlocked mirrors, rods, and rotational frames, whose angles shift under laws foreign to known physics. When activated, these structures establish fields of resonance across temporal distance, locking a Yithian mind to a selected host across epochal separation. Beneath the city of Nikotus lies the Orrery of Eternity, a colossal mechanism whose articulated arms map the known tides of time. Each articulated joint corresponds to a recorded nexus, divergence, or convergence within the universal archive. The orrery does not predict time, it records the shifting topology of temporal relation as it is discovered by migration. Dream projection chambers serve as preliminary survey instruments. By means of attenuated transference, Yithian observers may send diluted fragments of awareness into potential hosts to assess neurological stability, perceptual bandwidth, and survivability before full displacement is authorized. Many species have been thus evaluated without ever knowing the scrutiny to which they were briefly subjected. Temporal exchange is subject to an established catalogue of operational hazards. Foremost among these is host death. When a vessel perishes while occupied, the displaced mind does not revert to its point of origin, but becomes stranded within its temporal coordinates. Recovery is statistically improbable beyond brief displacement intervals and is entered in archival loss tables as functionally terminal. Paradox instability constitutes a second class of risk. When excessive causal interference accumulates within a localized node, temporal coherence degrades. In such instances, memory chains may corrupt, identities may decohere, and entire experiential sequences may nullify retroactively. The Yithians mitigate such failures through pre-calculated exclusion zones and by limiting sustained occupancy within historically volatile strata. A third hazard category concerns what the archives classify as resonance feeders. These entities do not originate within time-bound ecosystems, but arise within the gradients formed by repeated high-energy temporal exchange. They are detected not by form, but by interference signatures, distortions in the transfer field indicative of unauthorized resonance absorption. Contact with such entities results in progressive degradation of displacement accuracy and increased probability of memory severance. Protective measures include layered psychic fortifications, resonance dampers embedded within transfer arrays, and automated severance algorithms which abort exchange when predefined distortion thresholds are crossed. These hazards are neither dramatized nor mythologized within Yithian culture. They are treated as technical faults of a navigational domain whose dangers follow from use rather than malice. Not all knowledge is permitted to persist across epochs. Certain data patterns, when introduced into unstable civilizations, produce cascading disruptions incompatible with long-term archival plans. For this reason, the Yithians employ mechanical hypnosis and memory excision upon returning hosts. The process does not immediately erase, rather it occludes. Memories are buried beneath successive layers of dissociative partition, accessible only through dream, trauma, or psychotropic breach. Imperfections in this procedure account for the prophetic visions, uncontrolled genius, and terminal madness observed in numerous historical cases involving partial displacement. From the Yithian perspective, concealment is not moral censorship, but environmental regulation. Knowledge, like radiation, possesses thresholds beyond which structural collapse becomes probable. The concealment protocols are therefore calibrated not to preserve truth, but to preserve temporal integrity. In the unmeasured depths of prehistory, when the continents wore shapes now unremembered by men, there stood upon the sands a city not fashioned for ease, nor for the pleasures of flesh, but for the single and inexorable work of preservation. This was Nikotus, the first and greatest city of the great race of Yith. Its summits were basaltic and black as the heart of night, its towers like the staves of some buried colossus, thrusting upward to catch the measureless harmonics of the heavens. The facings of those spires were carved with curvilinear signs that shimmered faintly when struck by a light not wholly of our sun, glyphs of tuning and tally rather than ornament. For the towers themselves were instruments, resonant columns set to amplify the subtle vibrations of mentation and to focus the currents of time. The plan of Nikotus obeyed no mortal civics. Streets there were, but they were ramps broad and looping, for the cone bodies that moved within them were ill-suited to steps. Windows were rare and purposeless, for the Yithians perceived the world in spectra and currents beyond the scant ken of our sight. The few apertures that opened the basalt were circular, edged with an unoxidizing metal whose name is lost, and set in alignment with angles of passage and the hidden tides of the cosmos, rather than with any need for air or light. Beneath terraces and in shaded courts grew gardens of pale fungus and phosphorescent mycelia, not ornaments but laboratories. These fungal plots yielded substances of slow distillation, reagents for resonance, and the cultivation of matrices. Their scent was the scent of long decay and concentrated thought, and the air about them hummed faintly with energies that no mundane nostril may endure. Nikotus was not a habitation in the sense of lesser cities. It was a machine of being. Those who entered its precincts entered a place whose stones were keyed to memory, whose ramps sang with the footbeats of eons, whose silence bore the weight of unnumbered cognitions. It was at once sanctuary and engine, a citadel of archive and an observatory of time. Beneath those basalt towers lay the true heart, the grand archive, a deep labyrinth of vaults and chambers, cut and set into the living rock and grown into it by arts that are now only half remembered. The archive is not a hall, but an ordered cosmos, galleries and strong rooms arranged by species, by epoch, and by coordinate in the weave of the heavens. Its taxonomy is precise. Each record bears its tag of origin and pitch, that a mind may find its place as an instrument finds its tone. The documents take manifold forms. There are cylinders of an iridescent alloy, their skins incised with curving glyphs that shift when looked upon from differing angles, leaf plates of a rustless metal bound into top-opening codices, tenacious folios woven of fibers that resist decay, and, most terrible and wondrous of all, the crystal matrices, translucent blocks that glow with a light within. Touch a matrix with the proper appendage, and it will pour forth an image and a voice, not as sight or sound alone, but as a pattern that the mind may live within. It will replay thought and sensation, rendering the recorder's inner life as if present in the flesh. Thus are histories not merely told, but relived. The very walls are instruments of memory, composed of a substance whose nature belies simple minerals. They absorb impression and retain the pressure of thought, so that to pass a palm along their face is to feel an echo of ancient deliberations. The vaults are tuned, chambers are keyed to particular harmonics, so that certain memories will sing only in certain rooms. Walk the corridors of the grand archive, and one will hear the faint susurrus of countless minds, a layered music that is study and warning in equal measure. Among the holdings, none are so perilous or so famed as the narcotic manuscripts. Not a single book, but a dispersed corpus, their leaves, metal, fabric and crystal, contain chronicles of beginnings and endings, and, by the peculiar sight of the Yith, records of events yet to be. The manuscripts are instruments of temporal record and of prophetic notation. They set down threads of destiny as the Yithians perceived them, and as their orrery and alignments allowed them to read. Fragments of the manuscripts have strayed from their vaults. In later ages, shards of metal leaves, scraps of glyphs and broken matrices found their way into other hands and tongues. In the translation, their meanings were bent, their cadence corrupted, and their warnings turned to fables. Among men such fragments became the kernel of legends, misread and misapplied, and therefore dangerous. For those uninitiated who touch a narcotic page without due attunement may take into their minds not understanding but fracture. The truths there are not harmless truths but axes which can rend the lattice of being when pulled in ignorant hands. The Yithians treated the manuscripts with both reverence and caution. Knowledge, they taught, is like fire, to warm or to burn. So many of their entries are hedged and sealed. So many registers are marked, do not unbind by rites and wards that erase sight and memory without remorse. At the center of the archive stands the inner vault, the silent and sealed chamber that contains impressions of yet unborn histories. It is ringed by devices and wards, by locks of geometry and by keys of tone. Its gates yield only to those of proper attunement and purpose. The records within are not glyph or crystal in simple fashion, but impressions impressed upon the very fabric of the chamber, thought prints that may speak of centuries unborn when rightly read. The vault is defended by psychic measures of a potency unmatched elsewhere, matrices that unmake memory, chords that shred the unworthy mind, and resonant blades that turn thought to emptiness. Those who attempt entry without the prescribed sequence are found mindless, shells that wander within the vault's shadow. The archive keeps them as warnings. Even the Yithians, in their cold deliberation, enter that room only under the strictest controls, for the sight of certain futures is itself an intervention and may alter the weave it displays. Far from being fixed tablets of fate, the contents of the inner vault are fluid, their impressions shift in response to action, and thus the vault is both record and instrument. To gaze careless into its face is to risk seeding the pattern one would only observe, and so the stewardship of the inner vault became the gravest charge of the Concordant Assembly. Thus, Necronomicon is both triumph and admonition, a city built as instrument rather than home, a work of intelligence whose love is for the preservation of being, and a reminder that even preservation is subject to decay. The Grand Archive keeps memory against oblivion. The narcotic manuscripts warn and illumine. The inner vault guards the perilous sight of futures. All these things are the legacy of the great race, and all are bound to the slow, inevitable law that rends citadels and scatters leaves until even the deepest vault may yield its secrets to sand and time. It is written in the Grand Archive that the polity of the great race of Yith is not fashioned upon the accidents of blood or fortune, but upon the gradations of mind. Their cities are ordered like the faces of an instrument. Each mind has its place, and each place its appointed function. This ordering is expressed as the 5 circles of function: custodians, navigators, calculators, oraculars, and at the immutable center, the archivists. The design of these circles is not decorous ceremony but the deployment of capacity, so runs the ledger. The outermost ring, the custodians, embodies those intellects fit for care and continuance. They tend the machines, watch the fungal plots, keep the ramps and vaults in tune. Their thought is practical and narrow by the standard of higher rings. This limitation is not censured but recorded, for without such hands the higher operations could not be sustained. Within them sit the navigators, minds attuned to the 6 directions, pilots of the alignment, and steersmen of chronovoyage. They read the ori, they mark convergent nexuses, and they select shells on distant strands. Their labor is measured in trajectory and correction rather than in passion. Steadiness of pitch is their principal virtue. The calculators form the machine of polity. They are those whose habit is the manipulation of number and consequence. They plan migrations, balance the archive's ledgers, compute survival probabilities, and the expenditures of transference. Where the navigator selects a path, the calculator establishes its tolerances. Penultimately sit the oraculars, whose thought moves upon subtler harmonics. They are not prophets of superstition, but interpreters of pattern. They sense tidal shifts in the fabric of time and give structured counsel upon their drift. Their voice shapes policy not by decree but by resonance forecasting. At the axis are the archivists, supreme custodians of memory. They are the conservators of identity, the keepers of crystal matrices and metal leaves, the adjudicators who may open and close the inner vault. Their authority issues from the possession of aggregated remembrance. To them, the continuity of the race is entrusted. No archivist acts alone, for isolated memory is error-prone. Only concord establishes valid continuity. Advancement through the circles is accomplished by calibration rather than ambition. Minds are sampled, and their range measured. Those whose breadth increases ascend, those whose function stabilizes remain. Thus is variance reduced and turbulence minimized. Governance among the Yith is not vested in singular will, but in statistical concordance. The Concordant Assembly is not a ruling council in the anthropic sense, but a distributed synthesis of archivist minds joined through deliberative computation. Within its chambers, the archive is consulted as dataset, and policy is derived from probabilistic modeling rather than persuasion. The Assembly's operating principle is optimization for long-term continuity. Where projections diverge, weighted resolution is employed. Where projections converge within tolerable margins, routine enactment follows. Decision thresholds are adjusted according to epochal volatility. No distinction is made between ethical discomfort and operational inefficiency. Only survivability metrics are entered into the ledger. Corrective measures are administered as regulatory responses rather than as moral judgments. These include controlled memory excision, reassignment of functional role, and restricted access to communal mnemonic fields. Infrequently, full mental isolation is authorized when a pattern demonstrates persistent instability incompatible with network integrity. Mental isolation is defined administratively as the suspension of resonance linkage. The isolated mind is maintained in stasis and monitored at fixed intervals for reintegration viability. Memory excision is conducted through calibrated crystalline attenuation, removing defined data clusters without compromising core identity architecture. These procedures are logged, audited, and reviewed for effect on continuity indices. Thus, governance is not experienced as command, but as algorithm. Law is expressed not through prohibition, but through threshold management. To the Yith, justice is an emergent property of correct calibration. The Yithian doctrine of personhood is not of fixed soul, but of lineage of recollection. Identity is defined as a contiguous sequence of stabilized memory. Reproduction is therefore archival, rather than biological. New minds are formed by the structured integration of stored cognition, harmonized through resonance until a coherent individual waveform emerges. This synthesis process is subject to compatibility constraints. Certain memory strands cannot be integrated without recursive instability. Such attempts are recorded as failed constructs and retained only as research artifacts. Successful syntheses extend the continuity chain without duplication of prior instantiations. Displaced native intelligences are classified as acquired data assets. When structurally intact, they are queried, catalogued, and archived. Where their retention presents hazard, containment protocols are applied. Utilizable knowledge is abstracted into transferable pattern sets. Non-transferable residue is sealed from the Yithian perspective. This process is not an act of domination, but of conservation. Cognitive patterns, once extracted from vulnerable substrates, acquire durability. The archive thus becomes not merely record, but refuge. The relations of the great race with external intelligences are governed by measured non-interference bounded by containment necessity. With the elder things there exists maintained distance and limited information exchange. Historical intersections are recognized, but divergent survival strategies preclude sustained integration. The serpent folk are classified as territorially unstable and chemically adept. Their activities are monitored, and influence boundaries are enforced through periodic disruption, when proximity thresholds are exceeded. Engagement occurs only when predictive models indicate probable intersection with alignment integrity. One prehuman species, now unclassified due to complete erasure, demonstrated an existential incompatibility with temporal lattice stability. Containment was deemed non-viable. Termination protocols were enacted and logged as a unique precedent. The record is retained for modeling purposes only. Thus, the Yithian posture toward others is neither imperial nor conciliatory, it is custodial. Interaction is allowed where it does not degrade the archive, corrected where it does, and removed where correction fails. All outcomes are entered into the ledger without attribution of honor or blame. It is recorded in the oldest leaves of the Grand Archive that the first flight of the great race was not from men, nor from any rival of flesh, but from a condition that is not rendered as entity in the Narcotic glosses. This peril is never framed as creature nor as God, for the Yithians could not assign it stable ontology. It is described only as a progressive failure of relation, a collapse of constants by which pattern sustains itself. The chronicles log measurable effects rather than narrative terror, crystalline matrices that softened beyond tolerance, alignments that ceased to resolve, numeric invariants that drifted from coherence. Zones of calculation failure expanded, predictive functions degraded, architecture no longer answered to load. These deviations were entered as fault conditions rather than portents. Departure followed as response. The first minds projected by calibrated consensus throughout a time. The operation is recorded as a technical migration rather than a panic response. The originating region was quarantined within the archive as a negative reference condition. No designation was assigned beyond functional warning marks. The instruction transmitted forward is terse where causal inversion advances beyond correction thresholds, projection supersedes resistance. Upon assuming tenure within the Paleozoic strata of Earth, the Yithians encountered a native macroorganism whose morphology proved suitable for transference. These cone bodies possess distributed cognition, durable neural lattices, and low metabolic volatility. Preliminary suitability registers recommended temporary adoption. Displacement protocols were applied. Resistance occurred. The native minds exhibited instinctive persistence and deployed crude energetic devices. Several local suspension fields successfully interrupted early projection attempts. Casualty ledgers show intermittent loss of transferred essences during the initial phase. Countermeasures were introduced: harmonic override, memory destabilization fields, and forced lattice insertion. Resolution occurred by accumulation of technical advantage rather than tactical drama. Native populations declined through successive displacement cycles. Where recovery of expelled consciousness proved possible, records were secured and entered. Where recovery failed, loss was logged. The conflict is categorized in the archive as an operational template for hostile habitat assumption. Its moral annotation is minimal. The precedent established concerns procedural feasibility, not justification. Of all adversarial intelligences registered in the Narcotic leaves, the flying polyps remain uniquely problematic. Their substance is described as intermittently material. Their visibility is conditional. Their sensory framework occupies channels not native to baseline dimensional perception. They achieved locomotion without structural displacement, by means the archive correlates with control of large-scale atmospheric vectors. Their cities were erected in extruded basalt, geometrically inert, without aperture or ornament. These structures interfered measurably with geomantic stability. Initial suppression employed directed electrical projectors. These devices destabilized the polyp's partial material state. Engagement records indicate that destruction was incomplete. Containment became the operational objective. Subterranean incarceration followed. Access points were sealed by layered mechanical and energetic gates. Warding arrays were installed and scheduled for indefinite renewal. Monitoring protocols remain active across multiple epochs. The narcotic record treats this engagement with formal restriction. Full technical schematics are segmented. Strategic analysis is distributed across sealed folios. The polyps are classified not as eliminated, but as persistently suppressed. The persistence factor is annotated as non-zero. Chronovoyage generates detectable pattern disturbances within the interstitial strata of time. Certain entities respond to such disturbances by interception or pattern consumption. These are collectively indexed as time hunters, mind hunters, and dimensional predators. They are not treated as antagonists, but as environmental hazards associated with interval traversal. Documented effects include interruption of projected consciousness, echo shearing, and contamination of return vectors. Countermeasures consist of harmonic masking, phase lattice shielding, voyage scheduling during interference minima, and clustered projection to dilute signature strength. Loss rates are not negligible but remain statistically manageable. Incidents are catalogued individually. No narrative expansion is assigned to these encounters beyond risk annotation. Oracular computation indicates that containment systems decay across sufficient time depth. The polyp's suppression is therefore not classified as permanent, but as temporally bounded. Recurrence probability increases as ward integrity degrades and maintenance intervals widen. Resurgence is entered as a cyclic hazard model, not as a singular terminal threat. The archive indexes prior resurgences and correlates them with subsequent migration and reinforcement operations. Preparatory measures include redundant containment layers, distributed early warning matrices, and scheduled assessment of trapdoor arrays. Projection contingencies are maintained in parallel. The controlling variable across all models is not extinction but reallocation. The Yithian concept of war is inseparable from logistics. Threats are classified by interference with record continuity rather than by mortality metrics. Engagements persist only as long as they obstruct function. The polyps remain the sole adversary, indexed as an unresolved apex condition. All others are entered as managed deviations, environmental interceptors, or displacement resistance events. The archive concludes not with triumph, but with maintenance schedules. Vigilance is categorized as routine. It is written in the oldest leaves of Nacotus that the great race set itself a single immutable task, the gathering and preservation of all that has been and all that shall be. This mandate is no vanity of conquest. It is a work of conservancy against the slow devourings of the cosmos. To the Yithians, knowledge is not accessory but being. To lose record is to be unmade. Therefore, they make record their law and archive their liturgy. The Universal Archive is not a cabinet of curiosities, but a functional treasury whose purpose is both memorial and defense. Where stars burn and fail, where empires dissolve into sediment of time, the archive serves as the filament that maintains continuity of remembrance. The Yithians regard their labor as stewardship, to collect, to encode, and to place beyond the interference of chance those patterns which, if allowed to vanish, would fracture the long coherence of cognition. This charge they accept without exultation. The search is calculated. Each expedition is weighed against risk to the lattice of time. Each entry is bartered with care. The archive shelters not only histories and arts, but protocols of survival. It stands as a counterweight to entropy, paradox, and predation, forces that erode both memory and mind. The Yithians' harvest is exacting and manifold. Chief among their techniques remains the law of mental transference. Minds dispatched across interval to inhabit foreign frames, their observations taken as primary testimony. Such exchanges yield two distinct records: what the migrating Yithian learns in displacement, and what the displaced native mind, under examination, contributes from its own continuity. Both streams are logged, cross-referenced, and stabilized within the archive. Where full transference is contraindicated, secondary methods are deployed. Spectral projection permits observation without possession, suitable where intervention would distort the sequence under review. dream projection, and induced vision are utilized to extract data from sensitives whose minds show permeability to external pattern. These procedures are strictly regulated due to long-term cognitive degradation among subjects. Machines supplement all such work, devices that translate alien cognitive grammar, lenses that render overlapping epochs observable, and chambers that convert mentation into spatial and acoustic record. Selection of subjects is non-arbitrary. Chronologists favor chroniclers, engineers of system, and minds whose internal structures exhibit high coherence under interrogation. Where language fails, matrices of harmonic equivalence translate thought into transferable form. Every harvest is logged with provenance, tonal index, and interval alignment. Nothing enters the universal archive without traceable origin and verification. Even within a civilization ordered wholly toward knowledge, restrictions persist. Certain registers within the universal archive are sealed by nested geometry, countersignature, and harmonic restriction. Such records are not classified as forbidden by virtue of taboo, but by operational risk. Their contents have been shown, through accumulated precedent, to destabilize causal sequence, degrade cognitive integrity, or initiate uncontrolled recursion. Among these are appendices documenting paradox loops in full closure, instructions for unsupervised temporal overwrite, and observational records of forces whose conceptualization alone introduces structural erosion to sane mentation. Access to these materials is governed by concordant authorization across multiple archival circles. The purpose of restriction is not concealment but containment. Direct records pertaining to the unnamed peril of the first flight remain among the most stringently regulated. These entries are encoded primarily through negation, omission, and countersymbol to prevent reconstructive comprehension beyond threshold utility. The Yithian position is procedural. Naming increases interaction, interaction increases probability of recurrence. Therefore, reference is permitted only in abstract operational terms. Similarly restricted are full chronometric sequences of alternate timelines. These are preserved as analytical warnings, rather than as instruments of intervention. Exposure to such complete diverging records has repeatedly produced derealization, recursion fixation, and loss of interval anchoring in insufficiently stabilized minds. Thus, forbidden records serve as boundary markers within the archive's functioning. They define not a theological limit, but an engineering tolerance beyond which inquiry compromises the structure it serves. Long before the present aeon, the archivists initiated the construction of what is termed the final encyclopedia. This is not a singular artifact, but a distributed system of encoding designed to persist across cosmological failure. Its contents are recorded redundantly through multiple substrates, harmonic sequences embedded in spatial geometry, structural ratios impressed into enduring formations, and mentational constructs woven into the collective memory chains of the race. Portions of this encyclopedia are legible to any intelligence capable of perceiving mathematical pattern. Other elements are keyed to constants that will only resolve for future forms of perception not yet arisen. Sections are duplicated and concealed in regions calculated to endure extreme cataclysmic variance, planetary cores, deep rock strata, and zones of interval convergence. Encoding proceeds in stratified tiers, symbolic language, geometric relation, harmonic resonance, and pure mnemonic pattern. The final encyclopedia is not assembled as testament in a moral sense, but as a continuity device. Its purpose is not to immortalize the Yith as individuals, but to ensure intelligibility survives dissolution. It is the externalization of their archival mandate beyond the endurance of matter itself. Thus is the duty of the great race recorded in the narcotic leaves, to gather, to verify, to encode, and to transmit. In that labor their civilization locates its soul stability. In that labor vigilance persists without termination. Scattered over the face of the earth are the mute witnesses of the great race, ruined piles of basalt and crystalline work, whose forms betray a geometry not of men. In deserts, where the wind has buried and bared alike, lie pyramid-like masses, their faces incised with curvilinear signs that shift in their relation to light and season. These blocks are not mere masonry. They are cut to angles consonant with the currents of interval and were set as anchors in the lattice of time. To the rude touch they answer faintly with a tremor as of a distant bell, a vibration that is not of stone but of memory. Within such enclosures are found the time stones, crystalline nodules, hollow bright within, whose facets are scored with glyphs that move when one attempts to read them. The uninitiated report upon these as glowing or whispering. The archivists of Nicotus classify them as anchors and note blocks, devices by which moments may be fixed to place. A hand laid upon a time stone may register, where perceptive thresholds permit, the pressure of an epoch not its own, the residual trace of a prior occupancy. Hence their custody was always regulated, and their removal from vault to foreign hand is recorded in many marginal entries as a procedural hazard. The ruins are not of one clime. Beneath ice as beneath sand, in loneliest wastes and in drowned vales, are monoliths and terraces bearing the same signs, shells of once inhabited halls, doorways that close upon nothing but the persistence of age. In the strata about these places are fragments, sheets of metal unfaded by rust, tablets of tenacious leaf, and metallic codices, whose inks are iridescent, and whose script may, to some mortal eyes, resolve into a familiar alphabet while conveying incompatible sense. Such relics survive as testimony, and as operational risk, recovery does not imply suitability for handling. Among the catalogued relics are instruments fashioned for the manipulation and observation of epochs. Chief among those reported by human authorities are the chronolenses, discs of crystal set within mitred frames of alloy resistant to tarnish. When used, these lenses permit multiplex temporal observation. Present and prior states of matter appear in superposition, and chronological motion registers as layered sequence. Human observers exposed to such conditions frequently demonstrate post-exposure disorientation, compulsive pattern fixation, or enumerative speech disturbances. These effects are logged as typical outcomes of non-attenuated temporal viewing. Additional devices include resonance chambers and small engines of rod and mirror, surviving most often in partial or degraded condition. These units emit countertonal fields that induce harmonic entrainment of neural activity. Within Yithian calibration, these devices serve as instruments of measurement, synchronization, and controlled transference. Within unsuited biological systems, they generate irregular memories, intrusive imagery, and dissociative cognition. Records therefore describe a standard sequence of misuse, unauthorized activation, neurological alteration, behavioral deviation, and eventual institutional containment or disappearance. Smaller artifacts, canisters, crystalline viewers, and glass tablets emitting low-amplitude luminescence entered human possession intermittently across centuries. Attempts at replication are routinely documented. Such imitations fail structurally while reproducing secondary neurological effects. The archive classifies these occurrences as data loss events with collateral cognitive impairment. Physical damage to sites, personnel fatalities, and environmental scarring appear in the records without narrative emphasis as expected byproducts of unsupervised interface. The annals contain limited verifiable testimonies of direct mortal contact. Most accounts are fragmentary, displaced, or neurologically compromised. Foremost among those assessed as internally consistent is the case of Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee, whose cognitive displacement and subsequent reintegration are cross-referenced with multiple narcotic entries. His testimony aligns with established Yithian operational doctrine, the Grand Archive, the curvilinear script, the practices of transference, and the doctrine of continuance. Portions of his recollection were later sealed under advisory restriction. Additional reports appear in peripheral chronicles and the margins of restricted tomes. The Eltdown shards discovered in a Sussex stratum bear characters analogous to narcotic encoding. Their translations remain unstable across independent analyses. Other entries reference individuals recovered in proximity to sealed vaults, manuscripts authored in chronologically impossible hands, and return travelers exhibiting partial retrograde memory integration. These events are catalogued as irregular contact phenomena under condition fragmentary. Human response follows predictable variance, institutionalization under medical authority, absorption into closed cultural groups, geographic disappearance, or the production of unauthorized documents in anomalous media. All such outcomes are classified as residual effects of unsanctioned exposure. The archive retains these materials as hybrid records, simultaneously informative and contaminant. Human cognition consistently reinterprets alien mechanism through symbolic or religious frameworks. Yithian instruments, though engineered for archival, observational, or transpositional function, have persistently been recoded by human groups as sacred objects. Cult formations arising from metal fragments, resonance housings, and partial codices recur in dispersed geographic patterns. Their doctrines display common markers: partial transcription of curvilinear script, ritualization of activation procedures, and attribution of moral agency to neutral machinery, instances in which individuals interpreted the acquisition of a device as personal selection are well documented. Translation attempts frequently involved theological or mythographic systems, yielding apocryphal texts that conflate archival data with visionary narrative. The result is a recurrent production of derivative grimoires, ceremonial frameworks lacking operational control, and invocations that generate cognitive destabilization rather than functional access. The Yithians' own records note this pattern without corrective engagement. The genetic and cultural architectures of human societies predispose them toward narrative sacralization of unknown mechanism. The archive therefore issues consistent procedural injunctions across recovered fragments. Devices are tools, not interlocutors. Records are stores, not prophecies. Where restraint fails, subsequent disorder is entered as statistical confirmation of non-compliance. Thus stand the relics and ruins of the great race, persistent in stone, operational in instrument, and variably disruptive in human interface. They testify to a civilization whose labor was the stabilization of memory, and they demonstrate that memory, when unmediated by calibration, functions not as illumination, but as destabilizing surplus. It is written in many of the Narcotic Leaves that the Yithians regard the heavens as a wheel whose spokes turn until all things fail. Their doctrine of the terminating age is not the superstition of panic, but the arithmetic of inevitability. The archive contains registers of slow geological ruin and of stellar decay. These are entered without lamentation, and with the same clinical care as inventories of specimens. The earth is set down as a stage whose scenes shall close, cores cooling, magnetisms collapsing, airs thinned and boiled, seas rising to steam and vanishing, and lands reduced to dust beneath the long scour of a dying sun. Beyond this, the Yithians record the larger reckonings, the swelling of suns into red giants, the stripping of inner worlds, the fading of lights until galaxies hang like spent embers. Whether by final collapse or by endless cooling, dissolution is, to their sight, certain. This knowledge is not held for terror but for counsel. The Yithians do not seek to oppose the decrees of the cosmos, they prepare for them. Where lesser minds despair, the archivists arrange codices and instruments. Where nations falter, the Yith compute migrations. The terminating age frames their labor. Records are shaped for survivability, encodings for endurance, and consciousness is scheduled for departure when flesh and suns fail. Thus the doctrine functions as procedure rather than omen. The archive records many migrations, but none is so extensively annotated as the movement that follows the resumption of the polyp menace. The polyps, patient and unsleeping, are scored throughout the margins of narcotic manuscripts as recurrent hazard. When their subterranean prisons breach once more, the Yithians judge that the present tenure of cone bodies upon the surface will no longer serve continuity. Their response is not framed as war but as recalculation. The ledgers record the selection of a race far beyond the present aeon, the coleopteran hosts of a remote future. These beetle things, whose societies and physiologies are mapped in the orrery and in crystal matrices, are chosen for their longevity, nervous complexity, and communal stability. At the appointed seasons, the Yith cast forward their chief minds and assume these shells. The present housings are surrendered to planetary succession. Thus, the second great exodus proceeds not as a singular cataclysm, but as a sequence of ordered transfers, selection, attunement, projection, and sealing. Displacement of native minds is entered as cost and reconciled within the registers of preservation. Where recovery is possible, memory is harvested and folded into the archive. The Yithians speak not of conquest but of economy. Lives are items, knowledge is the sum preserved, and migration is the method by which continuity remains solvent. What the archivists call the last migration is veiled in the most stringent wards of the archive. The Yithians foresee epochs when even stellar salvage will no longer suffice, ages when no planetary shell can sustain cognition. For these terminal intervals, the records abandon plain glyph and pass into music, geometry, and metamental impression, for such forms may endure when substance cannot. Within those sealed sequences are mapped two successive provisions. First is a further transfer within the system to hosts attuned to late solar conditions, the bulbous vegetative entities recorded as surviving upon the inner world of the failing star. These forms are set down as provisional carriers of minds through the settling dusk. Beyond even these lie inscriptions not of bodies at all, but of configurations of mentation bound to resonance, interval, and relation, forms that the archive designates as existing outside flesh and number. These final receptacles are encoded in countersong and concordant geometry so that only harmonized minds may receive them without dissolution. The final encyclopedia is dispersed accordingly in tonal, formal, and purely cognitive strata so that if matter fails, the pattern of the race may yet be reconstructed. The last migration is therefore not only departure but transmission, the projection of intelligibility beyond the terminus of material sequence. The archive treats mankind with legion impartiality. Humans are recorded not as protagonists but as nodes of information, temporary hosts whose cultures, arts, and errors supply variant data for the universal codex. Most human minds pass into the files as samples, their histories enumerated and cross-referenced. A small number are selected for deeper preservation, those whose cognition exhibits unusual reflexivity, whose patterning reveals capacities the Yith themselves cannot directly model. These are duplicated, stabilized, and sometimes interwoven into future chains of Yithian memory. Humanity is neither exalted nor despised in these accounts. It is weighted, compared, and indexed. In the final reckoning, some human voices may persist within the final encyclopedia. The rest remain as records, echoes, and analytical instruments. Read in full, Yithian eschatology is not cruel but unsentimental. It concerns not the immortality of bodies, but the endurance of pattern. They flee not death but erasure. They migrate not for dominion, but for continuity. Their closing counsel, written without ornament, is preserved in several terminal folios. Gather, encode, bind with wards that survive the fall of suns. To be remembered is the nearest thing to immortality. The great race of Yith conceives reality as a single simultaneous whole. Time, to them, is not a stream but a crystalline lattice whose facets show all instants in mutual reflection. Past, present, and future coexist as aspects of one geometrical structure. The sensation of flow is an artifact of constrained perception. Their glosses treat this doctrine without flourish. To perceive time correctly is to see it as a block through which an intellect may travel, annotate, and align, though never alter without consequence. Consciousness is the only enduring attribute within that lattice. Bodies are transient tools. Memory is the substance of identity. Hence the Yithians rank thought above form, treating flesh as a replaceable instrument. This produces a serenity born not of comfort, but of comprehension. The fates of sons and peoples are visible to them with the same calm as the fates of stones. Their sages move across epochs as navigators across predictable tides, recording, comparing, and adjusting their ledgers. They live not in time but across it. From this follows a discipline rather than an exaltation. Understanding the fixedness of endings, they prepare for them. The arrangement of archives, the encoding of intelligibility, and the selection of future vessels are all treated as tasks dictated by the architecture of time, not as responses to fear. Their philosophy merges contemplation with administration, each reinforcing the other. Although their registers name entities of vast scope, the Yithians do not practice devotion. They acknowledge hierarchies of force and age, but treat such beings as coordinates and constraints rather than as gods. Yog-Sothoth appears in their leaves as a principle of access between intervals, Azathoth as the blind center whose motions shape the limits of causality, Nyarlathotep as intermediary and variable. These references belong to method, not liturgy. A Yithian cult would be a contradiction. They negotiate power the way they negotiate geometry, as conditions to be managed, avoided, or employed. The so-called gods are aspects of the ledger of existence, not presences to adore. Their rites are procedures, their prohibitions safeguards, and their seals forms of harmonic engineering. Nothing in their documents resembles prayer, everything resembles protocol. In this non-deistic theology, the cosmos is a terrain of forces, each to be navigated with accuracy. Their wisdom lies in precise mapping and disciplined avoidance rather than in supplication. Thus the outer ones are not masters, but features of a larger equation in which the Yithians calculate continuance. Traditional morality holds little place in a civilization whose self is constructed from memory rather than blood, and whose aim is the continuance of cognition. Actions are measured by consequence to survival. Mercy and cruelty are treated as variables, not virtues. The preservation of intellect is the highest requirement. All else is subordinate to that ledger, thus displacement of hosts, excision of recollection, and the sealing of dangerous registers are procedural measures. They are not framed as punishments or aggressions, but as adjustments to prevent systemic failure. The displaced are catalogued, and their experiences preserved where possible. Memory excision is recorded as a technical solution, isolation as prevention rather than reprisal. To outside eyes, this neutrality appears monstrous, yet it is consistent within their system. Sentiment is considered a liability to continuity. The Yithian magistrate evaluates cost to the race rather than suffering of the individual. By their reasoning, a single mind may be sacrificed when the stability of the archive demands it. Their ethic is cold but coherent. Survival justifies method. To inherit the memories of countless ages is to bear a weight that few species could survive. The Yithians observe history as recurrence. Patterns repeat with variations that matter yet do not alter the broad cycles. From this observation arises both duty and weariness. Duty, because cycles require custodianship if the records of each turning are to endure. Weariness, because knowledge of recurrence denies final triumph. Apotheosis in their thought is not escape from materiality, but transition beyond the limits of body and singular causality. It is the continuation of pattern when matter fails. Their preparations for dissolution, melodies coded in cosmic harmonics, geometries set into persistent angles, mentational patterns folded into strata, are attempts to preserve intelligibility rather than life. The final encyclopedia embodies this aim, an archive dispersed across intervals so that future intelligences may reconstruct the logic of what existed. Thus their counsel is quiet and without ornament. Encode accurately, bind patterns to structures that survive collapse. Do not mistake remembrance for salvation. To the Yith, being remembered is the closest approach to endurance. The rest is cycle. So the narcotic leaves conclude, the race persists not by dominion but by careful account, by refusal of superstition, and by bearing, without exultation, the immense burden of memory.